My name is Father Dominic Alleyne, a priest of the Archdiocese of Southwark and the International Pastoral Director of the healing programme named Grief to Grace. The law of the Lord is perfect, it revives the soul. The rule of the Lord is to be trusted, it gives wisdom to the simple. Thus begins our responsorial psalm for today, the third Sunday of Lent. I wonder if this statement resonates with our own emotional experience of what we feel the law of the Lord is, with our own experience of being told that something we're doing is sinful. I wonder, particularly as we hear the first reading at today's Mass, with its recitation of the Ten Commandments, whether the first reaction we have is one of the sweetness and refreshment, of freedom and wisdom, which leads the psalmist to speak about the law of the Lord in such positive, happy terms. Indeed, I wonder whether, whilst we accept the need for Lenten discipline, whether we regard this as something positive and life-giving, or whether, in fact, there's a little part of us which still sees it as slightly punitive, albeit salutary and necessary, a bit like a visit to the dental hygienist. That is, I accept it's for my own good, but hardly something about which I can get sufficiently excited or motivated as to go looking for it. There is an interview with the English comedian and satirist Peter Cook, in which he says in one of his funny voices, "My mother was very religious. In the beginning was the word, and the word was don't." I've heard it said that young people are falling away from their adherence to traditional Christian practice and morality in the West, because when it comes to the Catholic faith, they only hear our no. The "thou shalt not" is their mistaken idea about what characterizes our religious observance. To a certain modern mindset, there is an inherent tension between law and freedom. Freedom is understood as being the absence of any external restriction. Freedom is freedom of choice, meaning that choice has become a value, a law, one might say, in itself, detached from any reference to what it is I choose. Modern morality, in the sense, for example, that people speak of being pro-choice in relation to an issue like abortion, recognizes no law except the choice itself. This is an entirely arbitrary and false kind of freedom. Freedom does not consist in unlimited possibility to make a choice, but in an unswerving commitment to what is good, true, what is full of love. In modern times, distorted notions of freedom originate from a rejection of the notion of authority. In the ideas of Freud or Nietzsche, the healthy man psychologically is the one who has to kill the father or the authority in order to become himself, in order to become Übermensch, a superman who resists any restrictions placed on him. And we see the outcome of such philosophies in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. The absence of any restriction, the rejection of any higher divine law, does not result in the elevation of man, but in his hideous domination of some by others, a kind of kill or be killed. The first thing the scriptures reveal today, then, is how badly we misunderstand law in relation to the truth about God and his plan for us, but also how badly we misunderstand divine law in relation to real human freedom and thriving. The psalmist is clear that far from being restricted by being given a law, man is actually blessed. So I want to concentrate much of our reflection for this third Sunday of Lent on the Old Testament reading. This is in part because in a world and even in a church in which the authority of morality is in crisis, we need to recover the content of what we call the Ten Commandments as the basis for all authentic morality. We need to enter into that mindset of the psalmist who says that the law of the Lord is perfect, it revives the soul. If we cannot understand why this is, then in fact we will not understand what it is that Christ has done for us in his paschal mystery. We will end up with a very simplistic and mistaken opposition between the Old Testament and the New, in which one is about laws and commandments, with a kind of inbuilt bias towards Pharisaism and rigidity, and the other is all about freedom from rules and God loving us so much he doesn't care what we actually do as long as we basically have a desire to be a good person. In such a caricature, the Old Testament apparently requires nature to be regulated, whereas in the New Testament, grace simply converts anything wrong to make it all right in the end if I basically have the desire to be a good person. And I think that a focus on the Old Testament is extremely important in the context of our own Lenten journey, because Lent, and indeed Easter itself, will be more vividly understood and interiorized by us if we better understand the Old Testament. Why? Well, the paradigm for Lent, the source of this liturgical season of 40 days, is of course Jesus' own 40 days in the wilderness. But in that experience of 40 days in the wilderness, Jesus himself was remembering and recapitulating the formative experiences of the people of Israel who spent 40 years in the wilderness, in between leaving the slavery of Egypt and entering the Promised Land. Let's pause here and return in a few moments to reflect on the Gospel for this Sunday of Lent. Welcome back to our Lenten reflection for this third Sunday of Lent. A wonderful book by Pope Benedict XVI of blessed memory, called The Spirit of the Liturgy, has been very helpful in my own understanding of this whole desert experience of Israel. Hitherto, I think it was easy to simplify Israel's 40 years in the wilderness as the equivalent of a sort of layover on a long-haul flight. Yes, there's a delay reaching the destination, but this is just a kind of interruption in the journey to the Promised Land. Actually, the idea that Israel simply escapes Egypt and then heads for the Promised Land in a straight line really does no justice at all to the sacred history which gives us our matrix for 40 days of Lent. For a start, as Pope Benedict points out, the explicit reason for the Israelites to journey into the desert is not, in fact, the journey to the Promised Land. The command to Pharaoh is, in fact, "Let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness." This simple fact revolutionizes the whole understanding of the events of the Exodus. Israel is led into the desert for a deeper encounter with the living God. She's saved from slavery in Egypt to become the chosen people, freed from a toxic, exploitive relationship with an authority in love with its own power to dominate, freed for a betrothal to the All-Holy, who has heard their cries and has been moved by love for them, who has taken the initiative and chosen to free this people so they can enter into the blessings of his love. At Sinai, he offers them a covenant, and in response to the revelation of his holiness, they worship him. This should always be man's response to the revelation of God's loving choice. It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation, always and everywhere to give you thanks. Lord, Holy Father, Almighty and eternal God, we say in our preface. But just as worship is a fitting response to the revelation of God's holiness, there is a second response, which is what Pope Benedict calls liturgy of life. It is a moral response to the Lord's loving initiative. What is that initiative? I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, we hear in our first reading. I had a wonderful Old Testament professor when I was at the seminary who said that to understand this Exodus reading properly, we needed only to understand that the word therefore is implied by this text. I am the Lord your God, therefore you shall have no other gods but me, etc. The commandments are not the condition for the covenant to be given. They are the consequence of the covenant having been given. Just as God reveals in detail how Israel is to offer worship in freedom, so he also reveals how Israel is to live in freedom. Origen puts it thus: since there was a passing from the paradise of freedom to the slavery of the world as punishment for sin, the first phase of the Decalogue, the first word of God's commandments, bears on freedom. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The commandments which follow express the implications of this belonging to God by virtue of his choice. and his gift of the covenant. In fact, Scripture doesn't refer to them as the 10 Commandments anywhere. The Hebrew expression is the Debarim Yahweh, the 10 words, or Decalogue in Greek. This is an important distinction. In biblical terms, the Word of God is something creative. It was by speaking a word that God created the heavens and the earth. So what we call the commandments are in fact creative words. They create a zone of freedom whereby the Israelites who have been offered a covenant can live it optimally. St. Irenaeus says that the commandments prescribe love towards God and justice towards my neighbour, so that man would be neither unjust nor unworthy of God. What a gift! Through the commandments, he goes on, God prepared man to be his friend. This is why the Catechism tells us these commandments, far from being some imposition which limit man's freedom, are nothing less than the gift of God himself and his holy will. Because in making his will known, God reveals himself to his people. The commandments are a gift of love because they allow a people who were slaves and who had nothing to live according to the dignity of being a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a people set apart, as St. Peter will say. And they allow each of us that same dignity and possibility of being the friend of God. I said that I had to correct my own impression that the 40 years in the wilderness are not some indeterminate sort of transition, a kind of limbo between leaving slavery and taking possession of the promised land. In fact, they are the necessary preparation to understand what freedom is, whence it comes, what it is for, and how it is to be maintained. Pope Benedict writes that Israel is constituted as a holy people, not by some geographical or geopolitical reality, but by her response to this divine revelation, to which she must respond by right worship and what he calls liturgy of life, by living ethically. The promised land confers nothing on Israel which is not already implied in God's revelation of right worship and right living. Its purpose is as a place where these can be fully lived out and safeguarded. When Israel worships God as he wishes to be worshipped and lives the liturgy of life, she enters into a condition of which the promised land is an external expression. But in fact, without those things, the promised land is an indeterminate good. When Israel abandons right worship and living God's commandments, Israel will lose possession of the land to her enemies. When she carries the Ark of the Covenant containing those tablets of stone on which the 10 words are written into a battle zone, this causes Israel's enemies to be defeated. The Ark gives off a power. The 40 years in the wilderness, then we can say, is where Israel begins to learn to handle freedom. This was by no means something straightforward. No sooner have they been taught to worship God and given the commandments, and they start worshipping a golden calf. No sooner have they encountered God at Sinai and been told the direction of their travel, some of them decide they will hare off to try and conquer the promised land straight away. Despite all the signs and wonders that God has worked, they soon start grumbling against him and complaining of their conditions. They even become nostalgic for slavery, recalling that at least in Egypt they had leeks and onions to eat. It is in the wilderness of the desert that they are invited to enter into a relationship of radical dependence on God's will. It is he who will direct their steps and see that they have all they need for that day. Freedom, then, consists in being led by God. It is to enter into a relationship of radical dependence on his providence for direction and nourishment. It is to believe that obedience to his will is far safer and more life-giving than seeking to make happiness and salvation according to my own will, in my own image. Freedom, we might say, is letting God be God and not relegating him to the status of a kind of backup or endorser for what I have decided is best for me. Freedom is allowing myself to be led at every turn, accepting my limitations. This took a lot of learning for Israel, as it does for us. After 40 years wandering in the desert, It was a different group of Israelites from the ones who left Egypt, who would finally enter the promised land. Even Moses did not reach it, although he was allowed to glimpse it. We've laboured long on the commandments. What about the gospel for today? This dramatic display of Jesus' righteous anger shows us his zeal for the holiness of his Father's house. In other words, Jesus is zealous that his Father should be worshipped in a way which befits the holiness and the parameters for worship that the Father has revealed. In this context, anger is a God-given passion which mobilizes Jesus to take action against injustice and something dangerous, the defilement of the sacred space which is the temple, the most powerful symbol of God's dwelling among men for the Jews. The way the temple is being defiled is much like the worship of a golden calf, a refusal to worship what's been revealed, and a self-referential attempt to make holiness serve one's own needs. To seek to control and to manipulate it. What is Jesus' authority for taking control of this? It's the divine authority, a new revelation of God's presence among men. Destroy this temple and in 3 days I will build it up, Jesus says. But he was speaking of the temple that was his body, St. John tells us. The whole history of God's revelation to Israel now finds its meaning and fulfillment in Jesus' paschal mystery. He alone fulfills the law perfectly. In perfect love and obedience to the Father, he will offer his human body up on the cross, becoming the sacrificial victim whose eternal offering is now the basis of the covenant, a covenant not written on tablets of stone, but on the pierced heart of the Redeemer. All mankind's sin is atoned for by this fidelity, this radical dependence on the Father's will, and Jesus giving his human nature as the sacrifice offered on the cross that brings the life of the resurrection. The veil of the temple will be torn in two at the moment that Jesus dies on the cross, to show that the truest worship we can offer the Father is this sacrifice of Jesus. But there is no true worship which does not also imply liturgy of life. True worship is in spirit and in truth, so that I cannot claim to worship Jesus, participate in the Mass, receive him in Holy Communion, and then model my behaviour and my actions on something completely different. The more I come to understand that in baptism I was given the gift of a covenant with God in Christ's blood, the more I must seek to live by that covenant, which means living as Christ did, in imitation of his human nature by grace. I am to live in this mortal body in such a way as to make it please him who has united himself to this body through baptism, when I was baptized into his death and resurrection. So Lent must be much more than just a kind of personal spiritual muscle building. It's about learning that radical dependence on God by worshipping him in prayer and seeking to live my life according to his law at every moment, and not just when it happens to suit me. It means also entering into that powerlessness of Jesus crucified, so as to be raised up to newness of life with him. It's about cultivating a childlike dependence on God's promise that he has chosen me and saved me, and therefore freedom and life are to be found only in being faithful to his covenant. This covenant is not written on tablets of stone, requiring certain prescribed limits on what I may do. It's in fact a law written on the pierced heart of Jesus, showing me that love has no limit. There is nothing God will not do to bring me to the promised land, which is the life of the Trinity. The law of the Lord is perfect. It does revive the soul, because the law of the Lord is love to the very end. Love is the fulfillment of the law. This is why I must uphold and obey it and take it into my own heart. Thank you for joining us. Please join us again next week as we continue our Lenten reflection on the fourth Sunday of Lent.